Hey everyone, I'm Liz Rhoades, Head of Whiskey Development here at WhistlePig Whiskey.
And hi, I'm Mitch Mahan, Research and Development Distiller here at WhistlePig Whiskey.
We're super excited to walk you through our whiskeys from both a creative and technical perspective.
Over the course of this class, we're going to walk you through everything that we do here at WhistlePig, from growing our grain, our fermentation process, distillation, our aging, our blending process, and then finally, go over the entire thing, start to finish, and end with our favorite whiskeys.
Before we kick off, let's dig into a little bit about the distillery and what WhistlePig is about. So we were founded in 2007 in Shoreham, Vermont. We're at about 500 acres of land here, old dairy barn. However, didn't really start distilling until 2015. If we're counting whiskey years, that's pretty young, which is kind of like how we keep things around here.
Yeah.
And it keeps us fresh, keeps us on the cusp of innovation.
With that being said, we definitely try to still honor sort of traditional American whiskey history, but also we're not bound by any traditions here. So, we get to sort of take a fresh approach at whiskey making and a lot of the technical aspects that sort of like set us apart from everyone else. And it's nice to not be bound by that sort of level of tradition and sort of be free to innovate.
And I would say, even though between all of the whiskey making team, we have a lot of experience.
Oh, yeah.
As brewers.
Yep.
Cider makers, winemakers.
Yep. Just general, Renaissance team of technical experience.
Even though we're not really bound by any traditions, zero generation team, we have a lot of technical expertise, and we bring that all together to create an awesome lineup of whiskeys.
Yeah, I say it really shows off sort of the diversity of our skill sets and really sort of makes rye whiskey shine.
Yeah, it's like Captain America.
So I'll catch up with everyone later. I'll help cover everything from distillation to barreling, our blending processes, and all of our final tuning for getting whiskey into bottles. But I'm going to hand things off to Liz, who will walk you through everything from our fields to our mash and fermentation.
Whiskey has been around for a very long time. I've been fortunate enough to be in the industry academically and professionally in alcoholic beverage for about 15 years now. And my whiskey journey started from beer, as many of us do. And it's been quite a prolific journey. But rye has been a passion of mine specifically. And that has kind of led me to here at WhistlePig. We're here at WhistlePig Whiskey. We started in 2007 and started laying down whiskey in earnest in 2015. But we're sitting on a 500-acre farm, and about 300 of that is dedicated to our crops, which you might guess, most of that is rye. However, we do have some wheat plots and also a barley program. Oh, and I forgot to mention, we're in Vermont. So we also have a maple forest, obviously, and do some sugaring. The specific varietal that we selected to make our rye whiskey is a varietal called Danko. And we chose this because of the precursors specifically in rye that we like. So hydrocinamic acids, and those are bound to the secondary cell walls primarily. I've had some experience also throughout the industry and helped to develop methodology to make the selection process happen. And with that, we were able to select this particular varietal, not only because of the precursors, which I'll dig into in just a minute, but because we have a particular climate here in Vermont. It's not necessarily mid-Atlantic, but it's cold. It's not like Canada, right? So we had to select a varietal that was going to work for us from an agronomic standpoint, from a climate standpoint, but also that was going to bring in some delicious rye whiskey at the end of the day, right? With that, we landed on Danko, which is brought in from Germany, and the HCN, so hydrocinamic acids content, we were really excited about. With that, and if I can dig in, some more chemistry behind that. HCNs predominantly it turns into ferulic acid, and then 4VG, which is 4-vinyl glycol, which is the rye spice that we love for our profile, and most people love for rye whiskey, if you're not familiar with rye whiskey. We selected this particular varietal, and we've been growing it here at the farm for a few years now. We're a farm distillery, and each crop year is going to be a little bit different. However, we have methodology in place and great farmers that we have on site, team of labs also that have helped us to make sure our farm program ensures the quality of our whiskey. For example, we love our varietal, Danko. We test it every year, but then we have a specific set of mashing regimes. We have a specific yeast strain that we love that has that gene. So it's PAD1, which is the gene that's able to actually convert those precursors into what we know and love as 4VG, 4-vinyl glycol. That's kind of a part of our story. We are right in rural Vermont, and we're in a barn. We have our own character that comes with it too. I know we were digging into terroir and what that means, and we consider ourselves to be hyper-local and also taste of place. Taste of place is terroir, and whether that's coming from our fields, our grain, it's coming from our barn. For example, old dairy barn, lactic acid bacteria, right? So that's all a part of our terroir, and that's really important to what's being incorporated into our spirit, into what we're producing today. It's something that cannot be produced anywhere else, but we're all doing that very sustainably. We are 100% off the grid. We have solar skins and a full solar array. We produce about 21,000 kilowatts hour per second a month. And our solar skins themselves, which if people aren't familiar with solar skins, they're actually across over here on one of our barrel barns, which has a nice logo of WhistlePig. So if you're like flying over, you can see that. However, that produces enough energy over a year to produce 500,000 WhistlePig piggyback rye old fashions. Rye has a good tradition here in New England, and that's just due to immigrants coming over and planting rye. It is very difficult to work with, obviously due to pentosands and the climate, what the mashing requires, the processing that's required. But at the end of the day, it has roots tied to the tradition of our country in the US. Also, it tastes delicious. Quite a bit of processing that's required, and I think harnessing that tradition of the grain coming over from Europe and bringing that tradition over is really important. And also Canada, of course. We're so close, spitting distance, if I may say. But I think bringing all that tradition together is super important, and keeping that momentum alive is a part of it. And that's, I feel like, whiskey in a nutshell. It's traditions being passed down regardless of the cereal that we're speaking of, but specifically rye is something that's of a passion to us, and keeping that alive is really important. Preserving that, but also moving and accelerating it further. Adapting different methodologies, adapting different techniques, learning and growing. That's brewing and distilling 101. Rye is obviously our passion, but we do quite a bit of different whiskeys within that. It's not singular, and the different ways we can pull on that is either through the different fermentation practices, and also we do a lot with our maturation techniques and a lot of blending as well. Whether or not it's a cocktail occasion, so piggyback rye is great. It has nice esters, it has a nice spice to it, which makes it great in a maple old fashioned, for example. However, we have our 10-year, which is aged a little bit longer, 6 versus 10, and it's dialed up in those spicy, smoky characteristics. Still great in a cocktail, but a different experience as well, which we might enjoy neat on the rocks or in an old fashioned. And then we build on that. So we have our 12-year, which is in our core lineup. And we do a lot, again, as I mentioned, with barrel aging techniques. And so there, with the 12-year, we do finishing in different wine casks. So it's Madeira, Sauternes, and Port, 63, 30, and 7, Madeira, Sauternes, Port, respectively. And that provides a totally different occasion, which would be paired with dessert, probably. And then we bring to my favorite of the lineup, which is our 15-year. And normally, if we were doing a tasting, I would ask the room, 12-year or 15, which is your favorite? And we would get split 50-50. So 15 is my favorite because it has a more smoky profile, more glycols, etc. And I actually like it more because going back to terroir and taste of place. And it really is a true taste of place because we finish it in our estate oak that's grown here, right here on the farm. And the reason why it's super cool, it's colder here in Vermont. So versus in Kentucky or Missouri, our oak actually experiences a lot more springwood versus summerwood. And so what that means chemically, we get more of those glycols and those smoky notes coming through. That's why it's my favorite, just because I'm a geek, right? And again, it's going back to terroir and what we're about here, the farm. So you can't experience this liquid anywhere else. Predominantly, we are founded in rye. We love rye here at WhistlePig. However, we do have a portfolio. We launched bourbon, so our piggyback bourbon, which is quite a bit of a departure from our rye that is spicy but has a lot of esters in it. Our bourbon is smoother, also for a cocktail occasion, but doesn't have that spicy characteristic that we know and love with our rye. We also launched a single malt recently as well. It's delicious. It was a 21-year-old single malt, and we have a full program lined up to continue that program. We're just diversifying now. It's been interesting on the journey of it. I think from a methodology standpoint, what we're doing in the lab, our quality standards, and just training everyone on what these different profiles look like, what we should be looking at during the process in the field. As I mentioned, we have a new barley program happening on the field that we're experimenting with a few different varietals. We're involved with the American Malting Barley Association as well. So we're just learning and growing as a company and excited to explore because we are an innovative company and we want to preserve the land and be sustainable, understand what crops grow, and also understand what the full potential of them becoming grown up into whiskeys. And we're just all super passionate about learning all about that and making sure that we're also growing and learning as individuals. We are a super young team, and that's a part of, I think, the journey of WhistlePig. I'm the oldest, I think, on the team. And so that's, I think, a part of it is that we're just ready to grab hold and think big. Super passionate here at WhistlePig about our rye program and our whole ag program in general. We have our Danko here that we love. It is a winter crop, which means it's been in the ground for quite a few months. We won't harvest until probably end of June, early July. However, it was sown probably about September. We have a little bit of a longer season here just because we're colder. Once it is harvested, we will clean it up and then take it off to testing. And by that, we do a lot of different things. We also are concerned about ergot, for example, our moisture content, our starch content, our protein content. But what we're really excited about as well is the precursors to the rye spice for VG. So what we do is send it off for analyses with a partner lab and do precursor analysis specifically for HCNs, so hydrocinamic acids, ferulic acid predominantly. And we partnered with a lab to develop this methodology here, not only for precursors for flavor profile, but also predictive spirit yield, so PSY. So that's something that we're super passionate about. And by having that data, harvest to harvest is really important for us. So what we do every harvest, we do that analyses, and then from there we make a decision of how we're gonna change our process to yield us the same yield and also get our same flavor profile that we have in store for our brand profile. Once we get that data back, we'll either change our mashing regime, either it's going to be a slightly different temperature, or we'll change our enzymes that we're using, which is mostly exogenous, 100% rye whiskey, right? And then also we'll change maybe our yeast strains. We like the PAD1 yeast strain, so phenolic acid decarboxylase 1 enzyme that's associated with certain types of Saccharomyces cerevisiae and not others. We'll receive that data in and make critical decisions throughout the process to understand, again, what mashing regime, what fermentation protocols we're gonna take. Are we gonna do a slightly different fermentation protocol in terms of temperature or time, etc.? So all those things are careful decisions that we make. But then that also affects our distillation. So we might make different distillation cuts, for example. So here at WhistlePig, we're in batch rectifiers, which means that we're not in columns, but it's batch, but we have an 8 tray. And I think we're gonna see that also, but we had custom stills made that have little pigtails in the rear of the stills. All that takes an effect. What we're doing is careful decisions that we make from the field to the glass. Here in rural Vermont, Shoreham, Vermont, 500 acres, and there's not a lot else in the vicinity. However, we do have produced some waste, specifically spent grain. So we love farmers, farm distillery, obviously. So we've partnered with some farmers here locally and some facilities here that actually take our spent grain and they do anaerobic digestion to produce energy and heat. And that's actually pumped back into the grid to heat homes around Vermont. And that's something that we're super passionate about because we love to be sustainable, but also have this sort of community. And it goes back to, in a way, terroir and taste of place and sense of place, that it's not just us producing whiskey, it's that we're in this together. That's one of the ways that we're trying to preserve what's around us, because quite honestly, it is a beautiful place up here. We're on a stream that goes through our 500 acres, which we love, and it's such a beautiful place. Also, our maple forest, which is awesome. And we do our own sugaring here at the farm. One of the other things we like to do to preserve all of that is we take our own syrup, we take our sap, we tap. It's sugaring season, by the way. And then we actually barrel age it in our used rye barrels. So it's kind of our way of keeping hyper local, but also reusing our resources.
Now that Liz has really gone over, our farm, our grain, milling, mashing, fermentation, let's just hop right into the nitty-gritty of distillation. As Liz quickly covered, we sort of have a rather quick fermentation process that mirrors a lot of the American whiskey industry. We do grain-on fermentation. Our fermentation typically finishes around 4 days. But after that 4-day period, we take our mash and we move it into our stills. The way that we opt to do this is we will take a 1,500 gallon fermenter and split it into 2 stills to make sure that there's no variance between mashes. But from there, we have a few options we can use. So we have a combination pot column still that we have the ability to open and close plates as we see fit. This allows us to isolate certain oils or other volatiles depending on what we want to do with the end result whiskey. And this also gives us some versatility in terms of whether we want to take a single run, sort of like slow and low approach that mirrors much of like Armagnac and Pisco, or if we want to take a double or triple distillation approach that's more akin to Irish or single malt Scotch. Granted, we are a smaller distillery, so our stills are set up to have 8 plates that we have the options to use. But between having 2 stills, 8 plates, combination pot column stills, the versatility of whiskeys we can create is, I won't say unparalleled, but we have a lot of options open to us. And then also we spend a great amount of time and care going into how we select our barrels for our spirits, and then how we choose to have those spirits reach full maturity. When all the distillate that we produce here, we, for the most part, will create a specialty, either toast or char profile that we think really well matches our rye distillate. Or as Liz covered earlier, we do grow more than just rye here. Or we do grow wheat that we'll turn into wheat whiskeys, and we do grow barley that will either malt or unmalt and create malted whiskey or single malt whiskey. So with all of those sort of various dials and levers we can twist, we will try to pick the correct cask that we think would really highlight the final spirit. An important thing to sort of think about in comparison to us to Kentucky is our climate. We're in Vermont, so I tend to have a more mild summer, a far colder winter, but my summertime highs and lows tend to be where I get a lot of my nice temperature swings. We'll have a high typically in the upper 70s or upper 90s is sort of like the window, but then at night we'll swing into the 60s or sometimes even the 50s. So it's that day-to-day temperature shift where I pull a lot of flavors and really get a lot of wood interaction. But the flip side of that coin, as I mentioned before, is that my winters are very cold and they're pretty static in terms of when I pull samples for my barrels. A lot of the times I'll do a lot of my active pulling in the warmer months versus the colder because my interaction between base spirit and wood is reduced. In terms of how our stills are set up and then the variety of grains that we grow, we have a lot of options in terms of what oils we want to highlight towards the end of our distillation run, any volatiles we want to try to keep in the pot. But it's really highly based off of the base grain that we're using and then the targeted wood profile that we're going to have towards the end. And then of course, time is a factor for us. I mean, one of our youngest SKUs is 6 years old. And then if you dig deeper into our portfolio, we have 18-plus-year-old whiskeys out there. So all these things really go into deciding where I make my cuts in terms of heads, hearts, and tails. As sort of a general rule of thumb, if I know something is going to be destined for a far longer aging process, I actually want a little more oil in there. I want that oil to ethanol to wood interaction because you really get to develop some really nice complex flavors with that interaction. But if I'm aiming for something that's going to be younger, that's going to see, go from cask to bottle in a quicker timeline, I will try to really stay more tight towards that hearts run. And then, we very much embrace what I sort of call a artisanal distilling approach where I'm less concerned about trying to capture overall efficiencies and really just trying to catch distillate when it tastes the best. Depending on the run that I'm doing, I can actually have some pretty large heads cuts and a fairly quick tails cut to really highlight the overall ethanol profile that I think best showcases the base grain that we used in fermentation. In terms of barrel selection for us, it actually does start in the fields, right? We do have our own farm here, and with that farm, we do have harvest variations. So year to year, we do have higher yields, lower yields, and then, granted, we make a pretty high quality rye grain here as well as malted barley and wheat. But there are definitely some years that are absolute, shooting stars, and some that are just, they hit our requirements for what we want to use as our base grain, but we'll still sort of talk back to like, well, do you remember the harvest of 2016 or so on and so forth. So that's actually where we start. So depending on the harvest that we've had the year before, we'll determine the barrel types that we use for our final spirit. And then just in terms of a more general approach, we definitely hang our hat on rye whiskey. And rye is a grain, although it can be sort of a labor of love in terms of mashing and in fermentation, in terms of spirit, it is big, it's bold, and it's ready to play. So I have a ton of versatility in terms of barrels I can choose to really showcase both the barrel itself and the rye grain. I don't really need to be afraid of the barrel overstepping the rye or vice versa. But I do need to have a more mild approach when it comes to wheat and barley, especially barley. Granted, I do love barley. It's near and dear to my heart. I spent years as a brewer. But with that, it definitely has a little bit more of a feathery quality to it, like a little lighter, a little more airy. So I can't go into some of these more crazy exotic toasts, lest I just totally overrun all of the hard work we've done on the front end growing the barley to begin with. In terms of overall sort of cellaring and aging philosophies, there's a huge amount of talk in the distillation world about, do you really pull from barrels on high racks versus low racks, or do you want things that are on the aisle that have wind that move through it, or like I hear the south-facing wall of a distillery is, the best place to be. Some of that, there's definitely some truth to some of these things, and then there's some things that because we're so small, I don't know yet. So like, if, for instance, in Kentucky, we have huge talks about like, but the rick house over on this side of the property versus this side because it's in a hill or this, that, the other. As I'm sure you've seen, or as you will see, we really have our one large barrel barn here. And so my variety in terms of rick house placement is limited to one, but I do personally find there is a difference in terms of high to low and then airflow. But once again, there is such juxtaposition for us because I'm not just working with bourbon, I'm not just working with rye. I do have, it is rye, it is bourbon, it is wheat, it is single malt, and we talk about, other experimental grains all the time, but, stay tuned. With all of that variety, as well as the variety of cask placement, we are sort of discovering for ourselves and our climate, where's the best place to keep rye versus where's the best place to keep bourbon versus where's the best place to keep single malt. And then, with the casks we're laying down, we're continually exploring all of these things all the time. Personally, I do like, for lack of a better term, in my experience from my rick house, about 3/4 of the way up, south-facing wall tends to be some of the best casks of rye you can have. But I've also had some really great aisle, base level of the warehouse barrels that have just been truly spectacular. But if I'm going to pick one, I'll probably say not absolute top, close to top, south-facing walls, best for rye whiskey. As our whiskeys start to reach maturity, or even before they start reaching maturity, we have a sampling sort of regime that we usually follow depending on what we're doing. Of course, there are some exceptions to the rules based on certain projects, but the general trend line is this. If we have something that we know is going to be destined for, let's say 10 years, let's use 10 years as an example, I'll check in probably at the end of year one to see what's going on, but then I'll probably check in maybe every 2 years to make sure things are going according to plan. Very rarely, we'll sort of determine that something that we thought was going to be 10, actually it's really shining, around the 5-year mark. So like, actually, maybe this should get, put into the blend for 6. So, there is some sort of leeway there, but in general, I try to hit my age statements accordingly. And all of my cask work and base grain is sort of built towards that end. But so within that, as I would get closer to the age statement that I was aiming for, I will pull with a greater frequency to make sure that I'm highlighting the best of that whiskey and the best of the barrel that it was in. On a similar note, I have a pretty extensive finishing program, especially with our 12-year whiskey. Our 12-year whiskey is split into 3 parts and individually finished in Sauterne, Madeira, and port casks. And so monitoring that is definitely a labor of love, because depending on when I put that whiskey into those casks determines how long of a finish that I need. I do have a benchmark in terms of what I want my core standard of Sauterne and Madeira and port to taste like. And so I'm really judging based off of this control sample that I have. But once again, depending on whether I start my process in February or if I start my process in July, my finishing times due to my climate can vary wildly. So it really is pulled to control as opposed to pulled on calendar. As a general rule of thumb, I will taste through our single finishes almost weekly. And then depending on how close we are to that final end goal that we've determined from our control, I'll pull daily. Because one thing that I really don't want to do is overfinish. If you have something that's a little young, like you can always sort of like give it an extra day, but once you cross over that threshold, there's no coming back and you are stuck with what you have. Granted, there's some fun one-off experiments that started that way and then basically took a turn to a direction we didn't see that we, luckily enough, really liked. It's probably one of the reasons why I still have my job. You definitely have to keep up with it, especially based off of the cask. If it's a finishing cask, what was in it before? And then you also have to keep in mind, many of these finishing casks have different builds. So my finishing time for a port pipe versus, a hogshead, they're different. My microoxidation uptake is different. And then whatever base spirit, wine, beer was in the cask before influences what I have to play with for my rye whiskey. An easy low-hanging fruit example for me is Sauterne. So when most people think of Sauterne, they think of this really nice, light, delicate, sweet wine. And so they initially expect my Sauterne casks to deliver very light, sweet, delicate notes to the rye. But it's almost the opposite. The way that Sauterne interacts with the cask, its lower ABV and its sweetness, its sugars, leave a lot of wood tannin untouched. So when I put rye whiskey in there, I am now getting that real nice deep pull of tannins, which is why when it comes for my single finish Sauterne, it's really creating a scaffold of tannin that I can use to counterbalance against my Madeira and my port. So since we started talking about our 12-year program and all the finishing casks that work with it, I have actually right here the individual finishes before they get blended together in their 30% Sauterne, 63% Madeira, and 7% port. So I'm just going to start off with the Sauterne here. Sorry, I always cut off my sentences with a good sniff of whiskey. So as I mentioned before, the Sauterne, the way the wine interacts with the cask versus the way the rye interacts with the casks are totally different. So with this, although you still do get some of this really nice light florality, a little bit of nice sort of like honeysuckle note, you can definitely smell that there's a nice, strong, like tannin backbone that exists in this finish. And the way that I describe this is sort of the skeleton that I build the rest of the blend off of. Like it's through this tannin that acts as a counterweight that I can really play with some of the more sweeter aspects of the Madeira and the port. Nothing like some nice Sauterne finish. But with that Sauterne finish, especially on the palate, you really do get that really nice tannic scaffold that you would use to build the rest of your blend off of. It's very, very sort of oak structured in terms of its palate versus its aromatics, which are very sort of like light and floral. A really interesting juxtaposition that really helps for the final blend. Up next, we'll break down our Madeira. Personally, I think of Madeira as the muscle of the blend. It's what's really giving the overall blend its form. It's also doing a lot of carrying in terms of flavor profile. But immediately, even off of the aromatics, you get this nice sort of rounded, more melony, not the name, melon-esque sort of aromatic and flavor profile. You definitely get some nice, more like over-ripened berries almost, like not turned, but like definitely like soft, high sugar. And then yeah, going immediately from Sauterne to Madeira, you get this really nice juxtaposition of a very smooth and creamy body. A part of that, of course, is due to some of the residual sugars that are left from the Madeira cask. Oh man, I'm just such a fan. But yeah, so this is really delivering a lot of notes, and especially once it starts to like fade off your tongue, you do get a little bit, it's almost like fresh coffee grounds, but in a very sort of like present, like coffee shop sort of way, not chewing on coffee grounds, of course. But now we have sort of the cherry on top, if you will. This is the port finish. The port finish, in comparison to these two, is very sort of deep. It's very chocolate, tobacco, leather. But whereas, I mentioned Sauterne, if that's the skeleton that you build the blend upon, and then Madeira is the muscle, this is definitely what you would use as like dressing. So this is, if we're going to compare it to a person, like this is your tuxedo, this is your gala dress. And although I really do like port by itself, if you dial down Madeira too much and you dial down Sauterne too much, the joke I usually make is it's like putting a baby in a tuxedo. Yeah, the tuxedo is great by itself, but without anything else to fill it out, it just sort of falls flat. And yeah, much in the same way of the aromatics, you do get this really nice sort of chocolate note that sort of pervades out through. It really lingers. But too much of that and the blend sort of becomes a little flabby. Yeah, man. So just as a sort of a bonus program we do here, for a very select few, we will actually allow people to create their own blends. And so I've seen almost every iteration of blend that you could have with our whiskeys. But it's funny, 90% of the time, their final blends stick very close to the original 30-63-7. And it really is because that's where the greatest balance between all three is, where you get the highs and lows of each without anybody overstepping any other finish. It's really sort of like the classic three-piece band of, frontman, guitarist, and then drummer. You need all three. You can't dial up any one too much, otherwise the entire song's ruined. Cheers. Within our single finish program, it's sort of the first steps of us in terms of our innovation. I have at least 30 finishing casks working at any time that are all different cask varietals. This allows me to really see new things that rye can do in a space that perhaps people aren't used to seeing it. And it also forms the basis of, it's the trial ground for Boss Hog, really. And then with that, you'll see, especially in early iterations of Boss Hog, that some of the casks we used were really some of our favorite casks from our single finish program that then we decided to scale up because we thought the cask was so amazing and it really highlighted the rye in a way that we couldn't get with standard American oak or any other cask. So that's really where our innovation program sort of starts. It's where it takes root. Of course, we've had many iterations of Boss Hog. The 11th iteration of Boss Hog will release this year. And so with that, you sort of see a development in terms of where we really picked out some of our favorite single finishes, but where we also sort of started to change gears. So whereas there was a lot of single cask work with Boss Hog, in recent history, we've decided, as opposed to being simply inspired by a spirit or a wine or beer, to really be more inspired by place and cuisine. So this really starts off, we see it with Boss Hog 9. So Boss Hog 9 has a dual finish. Basically, we went to Greece. We were able to try wonderful Greek food, Greek beverages. And so one of the things that we discovered when we were out there is this beverage known as tintura. And tintura is typically, it's like a house spirit. So every village, every household has like their own slightly different recipe of tintura. It typically uses grappa as a base, but it's really nice. It has these wonderful notes of honey and citrus, allspice, like things that really we thought would play well with rye whiskey. And so initially we're like, oh, we should see if we can find a barreled varietal of this. And of course, there was no commercially available barreled versions of it. We realized we're incredibly intelligent distillers. Why don't we just create our own tintura? And so that's what we did. We created our own tintura. We used our rye distillate as its base. And then we specialty conditioned casks with that tintura spirit base to really deliver a really nice Boss Hog that reached flavors that you couldn't see anywhere else. So with that same idea, a lot of our future Boss Hogs, or Boss Hogs that we've seen since then, and for the foreseeable future, are really more inspired by place in cuisine than by a singular spirit. And with that being said, much like mashing in rye and fermenting rye is a messy process and definitely a labor of love, the innovation that would go into Boss Hog is definitely also an innovation of love. And as the research and development distiller here, takes the bulk of my daily time in terms of what I do every single week. Another major project for us in terms of innovation is our stock series. So one that's near and dear to my heart that we had done in the past was our road stock series, which of course was, we took straight rye whiskey, we gathered casks from some of our favorite partners, some of our favorite other breweries and wineries, loaded up our rye whiskey onto a semi that we then drove across the country from Vermont to Paso Robles, California, and then back to Vermont to have a really wild and dynamic aging process across casks that would have never seen that style of aging. That was sort of the start of a lot of sort of the more wild innovations with the stock series. Since then, we've also done smoke stock, which was, of course, we cold infused smoke into a rye whiskey. We wanted to showcase a smoke flavor in a way that wasn't already done before, in the same way that, you sometimes see smoked barrels or, smoked malts or smoked ryes. We wanted to try to figure out a new dynamic way to sort of showcase a flavor that hadn't been showcased before. In that same sort of way, sort of to cut back to Boss Hog 10, we used aromatic resins. We used frankincense and myrrh. So a lot of that conversation was really based around, hey, we use barrels all the time, but like, what's another way we can use, wood or trees in a way that is still impactful, that sort of takes us to grounds that we haven't been before. So we ended up utilizing aromatic resins of frankincense and myrrh to create a base distillate where we essentially ripped a page out of the gin handbook, made our own compound gin that we then ran through our stills, which we then aged in our own Vermont white oak barrels to create a cask that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, because the base spirit doesn't exist anywhere in the world. My background is, I actually cut my teeth in the industry working in a wine cellar. Not that I was doing anything impressive, clean tanks, did some base level tastings where I sort of built out my palate. But from there, I moved on to a brewery. And then from the brewery, I moved to a distillery. I mean, there's some steps and times that are in between then, but let's fast track this. But so between all three of those experiences, those different flavors, and then understanding the techniques and tactics that are used across those three industries really helps me frame how I think about innovation. I basically don't think about innovation from a distiller's point of view. I try to think of it more holistically. I'm lucky enough to have a lot of good chef friends, so I get to look at this also from a food science perspective and sort of pick their brains on things. Of all the people that I tend to talk to, I talk to a lot of retailers, a lot of bartenders, restaurateurs, whatever. But some of the best conversations I have are with chefs, because we are both very flavor driven, and we need to understand the science of how to get from raw ingredient A to final flavor B. Between the three sort of background experiences I have of wine, beer, and now spirits, and then regularly keeping in touch with a lot of my chef friends, it really makes me look at the overall beverage space in a different way that allows us to do some pretty cool things in terms of R&D. In terms of the proof that we like to send our base distillate into the barrels, although we've done many experiments with many different proofs, we really find that the standard American whiskey of sub 125 is the way to go, and we stick pretty tight to that 125 proof. It really delivers great result, very predictable results, which, consistency is king, and does it on a faster timeline than some of these other proof differentials we've done in terms of aging. On the finishing side, or on the finished product side, we do find that there is a differential that you should have in terms of where you want your final proof to land in the bottle. As we briefly touched upon before, 12-year is one of our lowest proof things we have in our portfolio, and that is because we really needed that 43% ABV, 86 proof, really highlights those single finishes in a way that if you were to dial the proof up to 100 in the same way that 10 is at 100 proof, you really start to lose some of those nice nuances and some of those more delicate aromatics versus 10-year. 10-year, you want it to be at that 100 proof. You want that higher octane to really deliver aromatics in a way that's a little bit more punchy, it's a little more vibrant, especially since, historically speaking, many bars have enjoyed using 10-year in cocktails. And with that, the fact that it is a little bit more robust, once you put that in a cocktail, it means that you don't lose the rye whiskey, but you also get to highlight whatever the bartender's using to create the cocktail. So within that interplay, their proof does matter, but I would argue it matters most on the finished product side as opposed to what proof goes into the barrel initially. As I had briefly mentioned before, we make our heads cuts, tails cuts at various points, but it can't hurt just to check in on the run to see where you are, how your distillate's coming off the still. So I'm just going to do a quick sensory analysis. Liz, would you like to join me?
Sure. And as we mentioned before, we're in batch rectifiers. We have 2 of them. And the adorable part that I mentioned, we have pigtails in the rear, but we're in an 8-tray batch rectifier.
A little bit goes a long way. So we're getting towards the end.
Yeah, I would say. So we're toward the end, and we're about to finish our hearts run and cut to tails.
Yeah, exactly.
Pigtails.
Pigtails. Cheers. So yeah, really all you want is just like a drop on the palate. Cool. Tastes pretty good.
Cool.
Hello, friends. Why, hello.
The name kind of originated from, I think, us being tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's kind of a playful noise, or playful, okay.
It's fine. He'll crush the whole thing.
Playful brand name, and so I think that just speaks to what we're about at WhistlePig, is that we don't take ourselves very too seriously. And they're cute, eh?
As the story goes, when this farm was purchased from the family that last owned it, although historically it was a dairy farm, it had sort of fallen out of being a dairy farm. And when the entire property was acquired, part of the deal was like, listen, we just have these animals, like, figure out what you want to do with them, or like, we can take them to slaughter, whatever. And we're like, no, we'll hang on to these.
We'll keep them. They seem fine enough.
Well, and I think they're grand.
They're pretty cute.
But Mortimer apparently was known for escaping from the pig pen and working his way into the church mill and trying to cut into some of the bags of rye from the previous harvest, where he would sort of eat to his fill, and then someone would have to basically like grab the tractor to like pick him up because he was such a heavy pig and like bring him back up here. But while he was sleeping, word on the street is he sort of did like the quintessential,
in the dairy barn, right?
No, in the church mill.
In church mill.
In the church mill, would sort of whistle as he slept, or just the way he would snore sounded like a whistle. So that is where the
WhistlePig,
the name of WhistlePig, originated.
Hi everyone, we just fed the pigs, and now welcome to the Sugar Shack. Let's come on in. We're inside the Sugar Shack here on our property. We actually sit on a maple forest. There's about 1,000 taps, and we're pretty in the thick of peak tap time. That's what we call it here in Vermont. And so that's when we tap our maple forest and the sap and turn it into maple syrup, of course. So here we have behind us in our sugar shack, which is where we take in our sap and then evaporate it into maple syrup. We are really excited about our maple syrup because we do take our maple syrup in and then put it in our used rye barrels. So it's a really special process for us and hope everyone can enjoy that.
Now that we've given you a more in-depth view to our process, let's look at our absolute final result, which is the end result whiskey. Let's start things off with Piggyback Rye.
So this is our 100% rye whiskey, our flagship. It's meant for more of a cocktail occasion. It's a 6-year-old. And what's the proof again?
So its proof is 96.56.
Wow, cool. So at a higher proof, again, meant for a cocktail occasion.
Yep.
And what do you love about this, Mitch?
I mean, looking at our entire lineup of whiskeys that we have, I love the versatility of this. Like, it's really built out well in terms of the 100% rye gives you that nice sort of like punchy black pepper that you come to know and love about rye.
The herbaceousness, the rye spice.
Exactly. And like you still have some of those nice softer baking spices in the background. But then like just due to the char profile we have, you also get a nice little dose of like vanilla caramel. So your versatility for cocktails is really, the world is your oyster.
What I love about it is the ester profile.
Yeah, I mean, agreed.
So alpha hexanoate, I think it makes a really good base for maple old fashioned, maybe.
Couldn't agree more. Cheers. I just love it. I can't say it enough, but like that black pepper just right up front. Love it. Love it so much. It's nice. It also has like this really nice sort of like, almost like dry cedary profile to it once it sort of starts to evaporate off your tongue.
Yeah, I agree. With that higher proof, as it sits, there's so much profile that comes out. So I get the ester profile up front.
Yeah.
Again, with that orange and that snow, that apple, but then really evolves and brings out more of the phenol characteristics.
Yeah, absolutely. Took the words right out of my mouth. So now that we've finished talking about our 6-year-old rye whiskey, let's move into our 6-year-old bourbon whiskey.
We like to consider this yin and yang, as you can see. And it's a complete juxtaposition to the spice profile that we just talked about here with our rye. And with our bourbon, it's a lot smoother profile, has much more creamy, much more vanillin.
I mean, just its overall mouthfeel from the corn, like it really delivers something that's like, has a way more silky texture in juxtaposition to like the Piggyback Rye, which has a very sort of like sharp and spicy character. It really is yin and yang, night and day.
Let's dig in and talk a little bit more about our Piggyback bourbon.
Sounds good to me.
Although we're rye connoisseurs.
Naturally, rye is definitely near and dear to our hearts.
We're excited to expand our portfolio into bourbon. With that, we're gonna explore our Piggyback bourbon here. Also aged 6 years and at 100 proof. And let's dig in.
Sorry, I got ahead of you there. Couldn't resist.
Yeah, I know. What are you getting, Mitch?
Hang on, I'm trying to maximize my aromatics on the inside of the glass here. I just get huge, vibrant vanilla.
Yeah, I always get a lot of vanilla, brown sugar.
Yeah, it's funny. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it almost reminds me of candy corn. Like, I guess it's just because of the going from dry and spicy into this more like sweeter, creamier whiskey profile. Like, it's playing a trick on my brain.
Shall we?
I think we shall. Cheers. It's like butter. It's like butter. Love it.
But not diacetyl.
But not diacetyl. Very important. Yeah. Not a huge fan of diacetyl. But no, just between the cow with the corn that we have in this as its sort of base, like it's just, it's so creamy. It's so hard for me to like pull away from that. But like that is like the main thing that I stick to. but you still get these really nice bright aromatics. Like you definitely do get those nice sort of like more vanilla than caramel, but still that nice sweet, more sort of like sweet baking sort of spices.
For me, vanilla and brown sugar.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely taste it.
And less esters, but definitely not diacetyl.
It's so funny. I'm so tooled against diacetyl from all of my lagering days at the brewery.
I know.
I'm hypersensitive to it. It's terrible. That and butyric acid. I'm overly sensitive to both of these things.
Brewer's curse.
Brewer's curse. So now that we finished up both our 6-year rye and 6-year bourbon, let's get into our cornerstone here, and let's talk about our, 10-year-old rye whiskey. When we had originally developed this, we wanted to sort of reset people's perceptions of what rye whiskey was. And when we first started as a company, rye whiskey was sort of thought of as like a well whiskey that was just used for some cocktails and was an inexpensive alternative to...
But in 2007...
Yep. But then in 2007, we basically opted to get some 10-year-old rye whiskey and reset everyone's perception. So whereas at the time we thought of the rye whiskeys that were available as like spicy bourbon, we wanted people to know what big 100% rye whiskey tasted like. And so we needed people to understand like big crushed black pepper, bright baking spice notes. It needed to be something that had its own character, but could also like work well in other cocktails.
We like to affectionately refer to this as the Rye-volution.
Oh, there you go.
That kind of started rye whiskey uptake in the U.S., and it's the hoggiest, right?
Yeah. Oh, no, without a doubt, without a doubt.
And with that...
Yeah, I keep jumping ahead. So when I was talking about 6, I usually bring up sort of like vanilla caramel, but for me, the sort of like the wood aromatics of this, it is just like dried cedar, like it is old, like barn
the
wood.
phenols, spice characteristic, the tannins, the smoke, the glycols. Yeah, cheers.
Oh, sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. This is why we keep you around. You really keep me on the rails. Yeah, still nice, bright, freshly crushed black pepper, but it's not quite as punchy as 6. Like it definitely has a little bit more reservation to it. It's a little softer on the palate. But yeah, just the move of like crushed black pepper. You get a nice little small vanilla note in the middle there, but then you really finish up with this nice long drawn out tannin.
Is this an opportunity to talk about sensory techniques? We are at 100 proof, right? Which can be a little daunting sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. However, bunny sniff technique. Are we ready?
Sure.
Are we ready to demo?
Sure. Well, here, you demo this, and then I'll demo an alternative approach, depending on whatever suits your fancy.
I adopt the bunny sniff approach, and it's quite simply because your olfactory bulb, the thing up here that's detecting something in your glass and sending brainwaves up, it auto resets after 2 to 3 seconds. This is why I teach everyone to
the bunny sniff.
The bunny sniff method. And it's just short little staccatoed sniffs to quite simply detect what's happening in your glass.
The alternative approach that some folks prefer to use is, so you usually want to get a nice little twirl of the whiskey in your glass so that way you have a lot of surface area exposed to oxygen. And then sort of start low, sort of by your belly button, give it a swirl, and then slowly pull up to your nose. And then you typically will find a sweet spot where you're getting a lot of aromatics, but you're not burning out your nasal sort of receptors. Because, you'll especially see some wine folks who are used to, deep nose into the glass, going full nose into this, and then they immediately burn themselves out and need to pause for quite a while to let their nose reset.
Right. When we're going from wine, which is 12 to 15, versus 50.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is a distinction you should definitely keep in mind. I mean, even the delta from 40% to 50% is huge.
Yeah, that's something that we do here when we do our appraisals.
Yep.
We do both of those methods because we are at a higher proof, but we just want to make sure that we're detecting everything appropriately that's in the glass and blending accordingly.
Yeah, exactly.
To make sure that the quality is perfect every time.
Yeah. Cheers. It's what everything else is built upon.
Ryevolution. I love
Ryevolution.
Ryevolution. Yeah, that spice character in the black pepper, as you mentioned, it's delicious.
It's so good.
We just moved from our flagship, our 10-year rye, and we're going to dig into our 15-year-old.
Yeah. It seems sort of counterintuitive that we'd go from 10 to 15 when we know there's a 12 smack dab in the middle. But just in terms of sensory analysis and how each whiskey is built and showcases very unique things about the casks involved, it makes more sense to jump right into 15 and save 12 for dessert, if you will.
The cool thing about our 15, again, high rye content. I love 15. I'm biased.
I mean, listen, as a barrel person and as someone whose like main claim to fame is really more on the dark side of spirits, if you will, once whiskey has gone through barrel aging and had its time in our barrel house sort of reaching its perfection, and then when it comes time for being blended, I mean, the fact that we have the Vermont oak in here really, it's definitely a cool perk of the job and really makes this special to me.
100%. And again, taste of place.
Yep.
And so this really captures for me what we're here about our distillery and what whiskeys we produce. Because it does have the finishing step in our Vermont oak, and because we know that juxtaposed to what is being cultivated in Kentucky and Missouri.
Yeah, your general sort of like Ozark lumber area where a lot of barrels get their American white oak from. The
springwood versus summerwood.
Well, exactly, right?
What happens here?
Because of the shorter growing season that we have here in Vermont. Basically, if you think of the classic cross-section of a tree and all of the rings are very tightly bound for Vermont. And with this, whiskey moves through that barrel in a way that doesn't typically happen with Ozark oak. And also there's higher concentrations of certain wood sugars that you don't generally see in your standard sort of American white oak from the Ozarks.
What we're trying to say is that the flavor profile is quite a bit different, and it's just really unique to what we're doing here at WhistlePig. Should we dig into more of the profile?
I thought you would never ask. It's so bright. And it's funny because like when you think of like a higher age statement whiskey, you know, you sort of think of something that's going to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more subdued, just because of the amount of time that it's had with micro-oxidation. You know, it's sort of like rounds out all the edges if you think of, you know?
Yeah, especially in our climate, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And our char levels, and didn't even want to cheers me.
I keep chomping at the bit. Once again, I have such a soft spot for 15. But yeah, so just because of the climate we have here, the Vermont white oak that we're using for this, it really has this really nice sort of like balance of vanillin, and I always mispronounce it, guaiacol?
Guaiacol.
There we go. So you get this nice sort of like balance of like sweet vanilla, almost like
smoky.
Well, exactly. So you have that nice juxtaposition that really creates a very special rye whiskey.
Which is why I love 15. It's hyper local.
Yeah.
What I like to say is because, again, taste of place, but also we talked a lot about community, and we're here in Vermont and love to support other companies as well. So we partnered with a company here called Danforth.
Yep.
Peter. And so this is their work here. All right,
I wish I knew more about their process, but it's not whiskey, so I am entirely ignorant.
And now, after we had 15,
let's round
we're going to finish
things out
it
with
out with 12.
There
for
you
dessert.
Go. The finishing pun gets me every time. I know I gave more of like an in-depth view of this in terms of its individual components, but now let's look at this sort of holistically as the final end result. As I had mentioned before, 12-year is finished in 3 independent finishing casks, Sauterne, Madeira, and Port casks, each of which, of course, as I covered before, brings out very certain sort of flavor profiles and aromatics. Yeah. But this is one of those, the sum is greater than, its individual parts, if you will.
They're all flavor levers, and that's a big part of what we do too. A lot of finishing, a lot of blending that happens, and it's hard work.
Times are tough. Cheers.
Cheers.
it's so sweet and approachable in comparison to everything else.
So we have the 3 different finishing casks, right? What's one of your favorites between the Madeira, Sauternes, and Port?
I mean, so I definitely have a soft spot for Madeira. You know, Madeira, I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think Madeira is sort of like the muscle in this blend. It's what's giving it a lot, it's carrying a lot of the flavor, but also giving it its overall form. But even then, you still need to have that Sauternes, you still need to have that port to give you the whole experience. And even like the nitty gritty of the percentages makes a huge difference.
63-37, right?
Exactly.
Madeira, Sauternes, and Port.
And I can't tell you how many times I get asked where it's like, oh, why didn't you just do, 60-30-10? That's a lot easier math. Like, it's like, no. That 3% differential makes the difference.
It does.
And then I get to walk people through the individual parts and I have them create it as 60-30-10. And they're like, ooh, this is different. I'm like, I know, I told you.
Well, that's why we did 60.
Exactly.
Yeah. So a little bit different in ABV, right?
Yeah, so in comparison to the rest of our portfolio, this comes in at a far lower ABV. It's 43%. And we did that in order to highlight a lot of the individual casks that we used in the finishing process. It's sort of the best proof that we found that you don't lose the rye whiskey, but you also showcase the best of the Sauternes, Madeira, and Port.
And the blending, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, I love it. It's got this nice sort of like,
and
almost like honeysuckle note going on.
The viscosity too.
Yeah, you see the legs. As someone who spends so much time on the blending side of things, this definitely is one of the more fun projects I take on.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks for hanging out with us while we got into the nitty-gritty of what makes WhistlePig Rye Whiskey some of the best whiskey on the planet.
I'm Liz Rhoades.
And I'm Mitch Mahan.
We're still stiffing 12. However, the great debate.
It is the classic debate internally. It's
every time we do a tasting.
And it's funny, actually, even with guests, I'll have this final sort of ballot, if you will.
Okay, 12 or 15?
I mean, I'm a 15 person myself, but...
Me as well. However, both are excellent. Cheers.
Cheers.
I invite everyone to go find their favorite WhistlePig.
Cheers to that.